There was a time when the Japanese Navy was considered unstoppable in the Pacific. They had more ships, more experience, and total confidence after Pearl Harbor. The United States was wounded, outnumbered, and expected to lose the next major battle. But in just 4 days, something happened that no one thought was possible. So devastating that Japan would never fully recover from it for the rest of the war. Today, a story you'll be proud to remember is about the Battle of Midway. By early 1942, the Empire of Japan appeared to be rewriting the rules of modern warfare in real time. What had begun on December 7, 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor had not slowed down for a single day. Instead, it had accelerated into a wave of coordinated offensives so rapid and so overwhelming that Allied commanders across the Pacific struggled just to understand what was happening, let alone respond to it. Within weeks, Japanese forces had moved with terrifying efficiency across thousands of miles of ocean, striking British, American, Dutch, and Australian positions with a level of precision that suggested not chaos, but meticulous, long-term planning finally being unleashed. The attack on Pearl Harbor itself had been more than a tactical success. It had been a psychological earthquake. Battleships lay burning in shallow water. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. The Pacific Fleet, which many believed to be the ultimate deterrent to Japanese expansion, had been humiliated in a matter of hours. Around the world, observers began to question whether the United States had underestimated its opponent, and inside Japan, confidence surged to unprecedented levels. The gamble had worked, but Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. Within days, Japanese troops invaded the Philippines. American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur were pushed back relentlessly toward the Bataan Peninsula. In Hong Kong, British resistance collapsed. In Malaya, Japanese forces advanced through dense jungle terrain that Allied planners had believed impassable. Singapore, considered an impregnable fortress by the British Empire, fell in February 1942 in what Winston Churchill would later call the worst disaster in British military history. The Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and critical resources, were seized. Wake Island fell. Guam fell. The Japanese Navy seemed to be everywhere at once, operating with confidence across distances that stunned military observers. This was not random expansion. It was the construction of a defensive perimeter so vast that no enemy could hope to penetrate it without enormous cost. At the center of this expansion was a naval force unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Kido Butai, the first air fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was the most powerful carrier strike group ever assembled. It consisted of 6 fleet carriers operating together as a single, coordinated unit: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Each of these ships carried dozens of aircraft. Together, they could launch hundreds of planes in a single, perfectly timed wave. No navy in the world had ever operated carriers at this scale or with this level of coordination. What made them truly dangerous was not just the ships, but the men flying from their decks. Japanese naval aviators in 1942 were among the most experienced in the world. Many had been fighting in China since the late 1930s. They had logged hundreds of combat hours. They were trained in precision, discipline, and aggression. Their aircraft, particularly the Mitsubishi A6M0, outperformed most Allied fighters in speed and maneuverability. When these pilots launched from their carriers, they did so with the confidence of veterans who had rarely known defeat. Their leadership was equally formidable. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the carrier force, had overseen the Pearl Harbor strike. Above him was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a strategist with a deep understanding of both naval warfare and American industrial capacity. Yamamoto knew Japan could not win a long war, but he believed that a series of decisive blows could force the United States into negotiation before its production power could be fully mobilized. And so far, that strategy appeared flawless. American forces in the Pacific were reeling. The Philippines were on the verge of collapse. Australia feared invasion. Supply lines were threatened. Morale was shaken. The image of Japanese naval dominance was so strong that many Allied commanders began to assume that any major confrontation at sea would end in disaster. Even within the United States Navy, there was quiet acknowledgement that Japan currently held the advantage in carrier warfare. The Americans had carriers too, but they had never operated them in a unified strike force the way Japan had. Their pilots lacked the same level of combat experience. Their tactics were still evolving. In just a few months, Japan had not only gained territory, it had gained something even more powerful. It had gained a reputation for invincibility. Newspapers across the world described Japanese advances with a mix of awe and dread. Military analysts began to speculate that the Pacific might be lost entirely. Some feared Hawaii itself could be next. The idea that Japan could project power across such vast distances forced a re-evaluation of naval strategy everywhere. And inside Okyo, this success created a dangerous confidence. Japanese planners began to believe that the United States, shocked and demoralized, would struggle to mount any effective counteroffensive. They believed American industry would take years to rebuild. They believed their window of dominance would last long enough to fortify their defensive perimeter and make any attempt to reclaim territory too costly to attempt. But there was one thing they did not account for. They did not account for the fact that the United States was already learning, already adapting, and already preparing to strike back in a way no one in Tokyo could yet see. Because while the Japanese Navy sailed with confidence across the Pacific, believing itself unmatched, a quiet battle of intelligence, logistics, and decision-making was unfolding thousands of miles away. A battle that would determine whether this illusion of invincibility would survive the year. And at the center of that unseen struggle were men in windowless rooms, staring at intercepted messages, trying to piece together a puzzle that would soon decide the fate of the Pacific War. While Japanese forces continued expanding across the Pacific with extraordinary speed, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was already thinking several moves ahead. Unlike many in the Japanese High Command, Yamamoto did not celebrate victory with complacency. He understood the deeper reality of the war Japan had chosen to start. He had lived in the United States. He had studied at Harvard. He had traveled through American cities and seen factories that seemed to stretch for miles. He knew that if the conflict became a prolonged industrial struggle, Japan would lose. There was no scenario in which Japanese shipyards and aircraft plants could outproduce American industry year after year. For Yamamoto, time was the enemy. The early victories after Pearl Harbor had created what he believed was a narrow window of opportunity. American morale was shaken. Their Pacific fleet was wounded. Their carriers were still few. If Japan could deliver one more decisive blow, one that destroyed the remaining American carrier strength, the United States might be forced to negotiate before its industrial power could fully awaken. But that meant finding and destroying the American carriers. The problem was that after Pearl Harbor, those carriers were nowhere to be found. They had not been in port during the attack. They had survived. And they were now the most dangerous threat Japan faced. Yamamoto's solution was both bold and complex. He would not search for the American carriers, he would force them to come to him. The target he selected was Midway Atoll. Midway was small, isolated, and easy to overlook on a map, but its location made it a forward outpost for American reconnaissance and a potential staging ground for operations toward Japan's expanding perimeter. If Japan captured Midway, it could extend its defensive line far into the Pacific and threaten Hawaii directly. More importantly, Yamamoto believed the United States would never allow Midway to fall without a fight. The Americans would send their carriers to defend it, and that was exactly what he wanted. The plan, known as Operation MI, was incredibly detailed. A diversionary force would strike the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, pulling American attention north. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo and the Kido Butai would approach Midway from the west with 4 of Japan's finest carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. A powerful invasion force would follow behind, ready to land troops once the American fleet had been destroyed. Yamamoto himself would command a distant battleship force ready to move in and finish off whatever remained. On paper, the plan was brilliant. It relied on deception, speed, and the assumption that the Americans would react predictably. Japanese intelligence believed the United States had at most 2 operational carriers in the Pacific. Japan would be bringing 4. The odds seemed overwhelming. There was, however, a flaw hidden deep inside the plan, a flaw that no one in Tokyo could see. The Japanese plan depended entirely on surprise. And by late May 1942, surprise no longer existed. In a basement at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team of cryptanalysts had been living a strange, exhausting routine for months. They worked in a room nicknamed Hypo, filled with intercepted Japanese radio transmissions written in strings of numbers and symbols that made no immediate sense. Rochefort was brilliant, unconventional, and relentless. He wore a bathrobe to work. He slept on a cot in the office. He pushed his team constantly, convinced that hidden inside those messages was something critical. Among those working closely with him was Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, the Pacific Fleet's intelligence officer, and a man who had spent years studying Japanese naval doctrine. Layton had a rare ability to interpret not just what the Japanese were saying, but how they were thinking. Piece by piece, they began to see a pattern. Repeated references appeared to a location labeled only as AF. Traffic increased dramatically. Something large was being prepared. Rochefort believed AF meant Midway, but he needed proof. So the Americans did something simple and clever. They sent an unencrypted message from Midway stating that the island's freshwater condenser had failed and they were running short of water. Soon after, Japanese transmissions were intercepted reporting that AF is short on water. That was all the confirmation Nimitz needed. For the first time in modern naval history, one side knew almost exactly what the other was planning before the battle even began. When Layton presented the intelligence to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the situation became clear. The Japanese were coming from Midway. They would arrive in early June. They would bring carriers. And they believed the Americans would be caught off guard. But Nimitz's situation was far from comfortable. His fleet was still recovering from Pearl Harbor. He had 3 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, and the badly damaged Yorktown, which had barely survived the Battle of the Coral Sea weeks earlier. Yorktown was limping back to Pearl Harbor, her decks scorched, her structure weakened. Repair estimates suggested weeks of work. Nimitz gave the shipyard workers 72 hours. In one of the most remarkable logistical feats of the war, thousands of workers swarmed over Yorktown day and night. They patched holes, replaced wiring, repaired flight decks, and restored enough functionality to make her battle-ready. She would not be perfect, but she would sail, because Nimitz understood something critical. This was not just another battle. This was the moment Yamamoto had been waiting for, and if the Americans played their cards correctly, it could be the moment Japan's confidence shattered for the first time. Nimitz made a decision that stunned some of his officers. He would not position his carriers to defend Midway directly. He would place them northeast of the island, hidden, silent, waiting. The Japanese would launch their strike against Midway, believing they had surprise. Only after they committed their aircraft would the American carriers reveal themselves. The hunters would become the hunted. And neither Yamamoto nor Nagumo had any idea that the trap they believed they were setting had already been turned against them. In the early hours of June 4th, 1942, the Pacific Ocean was calm and deceptively quiet. Hundreds of miles west of Midway Atoll, the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, moved steadily through the water in perfect formation. On their decks, flight crews worked under dim red lights, preparing aircraft for launch. Engines were warmed, bombs were secured, fuel lines were checked and rechecked. This was a routine they had performed many times before in Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean, in raids that had ended with smoking enemy ships and triumphant returns. There was no reason to believe this morning would be any different. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the strike force from the bridge of Akagi, had every reason to feel confident. His carriers were manned by veterans. His pilots were among the best in the world. Intelligence suggested the Americans were unaware of his presence. Midway would be struck at dawn, its defenses neutralized, and then the fleet would wait patiently for the inevitable American response. At 4:30 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft began to lift off the carrier decks. A total of 108 planes, bombers, fighters, and torpedo aircraft rose into the dark sky, forming up for the long flight to Midway. Leading them was Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the same officer who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. For many of these pilots, this felt like a continuation of the same unstoppable momentum they had been riding since December. At Midway, American radar detected the incoming formation while it was still miles away. Sirens sounded across the island. Pilots scrambled to their aircraft. Anti-aircraft crews rushed to their guns. There was no panic, but there was urgency. They knew they were about to be hit hard. The bombing began shortly after sunrise. Japanese planes swept over Midway's airfield, dropping bombs and strafing hangars, fuel depots, and runways. Explosions ripped across the small island. Smoke rose into the sky. American fighters attempted to intercept but were outmatched by the agile Japanese Zeros. One by one, they were shot down. The defenders fought fiercely, but the damage was severe. Yet something important had not happened. Midway had not been knocked out of the fight. The airfield was damaged, but still usable. Anti-aircraft fire remained active. Some American aircraft were still operational. When Fuchida radioed back to Nagumo, his message was clear. A second strike would be necessary to finish the job. Nagumo now faced a decision. His reserve aircraft, still on the carrier decks, were armed with torpedoes in case American ships appeared. Since no American fleet had been sighted, Nagumo ordered those planes rearmed with bombs for a second strike on Midway. This required bringing bombs up from storage, removing torpedoes, refueling aircraft, and reorganizing the decks. It was a time-consuming process, but it seemed logical. The Americans had not shown themselves. Then, at 7:28 a.m., a Japanese scout plane from the cruiser tone transmitted a message that would begin unraveling everything. It reported sighting American ships. The report was incomplete and delayed, but the meaning was unmistakable. Somewhere nearby, the American fleet was present. Nagumo immediately reversed his previous order. The reserve planes needed to be rearmed again with torpedoes. Bombs had to be taken off. Torpedoes had to be brought back up. Aircraft that had been partially refueled now needed to be moved around cramped hangar decks. Suddenly, the calm precision of the morning dissolved into confusion. Fuel hoses snaked across the hangars, bomb carts were being wheeled in different directions. Aircraft were packed tightly together. Crews rushed to obey rapidly changing orders. The carriers were becoming dangerously cluttered with fuel, munitions, and half-prepared aircraft. And still, Nagumo did not know exactly where the American carriers were. Meanwhile, far to the northeast, American carriers were launching their own planes. On USS Hornet, USS Enterprise, and USS Yorktown, flight decks came alive with activity. Pilots were briefed quickly, engines roared to life. There was tension in the air, but also determination. These men knew they were flying into a fight that could decide the entire Pacific War. The first American squadrons to reach the Japanese fleet would not be dive bombers, they would be torpedo bombers. These planes, the slow and outdated TBD Devastators, were already considered obsolete. They were slower than Japanese fighters, less maneuverable, and carried unreliable torpedoes. But they were all the Americans had available in that role. From Hornet came Torpedo Squadron 8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron. Waldron had studied the Japanese course carefully. He believed his superiors were flying in the wrong direction. Ignoring orders, he turned his squadron toward where he believed the enemy fleet would be. He was right. Waldron's 15 planes spotted the Japanese carriers first. What followed was slaughter. Japanese Zeros descended on them like hawks. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. One by one, the Devastators were shot down before they could even get close enough to launch their torpedoes. Waldron himself was killed. Of the 15 planes, 14 were destroyed. The only survivor was Ensign George Gay, who floated in the ocean pretending to be dead while watching the battle unfold around him. Soon after, torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived. They met the same fate. Entire units were wiped out, planes burned, fell into the sea, and vanished beneath the waves. Not a single torpedo struck a Japanese ship. From a tactical perspective, it looked like a complete disaster, but something far more important was happening. The Japanese fighter cover had been dragged down to sea level chasing torpedo planes. The carriers were maneuvering wildly to avoid attack. And the decks were still filled with fuel lines, bombs, and aircraft in disarray. High above, Unseen in the clouds, American dive bombers were approaching, and they had no idea they were seconds away from changing the course of the war. High above the chaos, above the anti-aircraft bursts and the twisting contrails left by dogfighting fighters, two groups of American dive bombers were searching for something they were no longer sure existed. Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bombers from USS Enterprise, had been flying for over an hour without sighting the Japanese fleet. Fuel was becoming a concern. His pilots were scanning an empty ocean. Below them, somewhere, the most powerful carrier force in the world was supposed to be maneuvering. But the Pacific was vast, and time was running out. McCluskey faced a decision that would become one of the most important in naval history. He could turn back toward Enterprise and preserve his squadron, or he could gamble a little longer and risk running out of fuel over open water. Then he saw something. A single ship cutting through the ocean at high speed, and it was the Japanese destroyer Arashi. Arashi had been depth-charging the American submarine USS Nautilus, which had attempted to attack the Japanese fleet earlier that morning. Having fallen behind, Arashi was now racing at full speed to rejoin the main formation. McCluskey realized that a destroyer running alone at top speed in the middle of the Pacific could only mean one thing. It was trying to catch up to something important. He banked his planes and followed its wake. Minutes later, the clouds broke. And there they were, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers turning into the wind, their decks crowded with aircraft, fuel hoses, and bombs. Smoke still drifted from earlier Midway strikes. Fighters were low over the water chasing torpedo bombers. The carriers were almost completely unprotected from above. McCluskey did not hesitate. He ordered the attack. At the same time, dive bombers from USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, arrived from a different direction. By pure coincidence, 2 separate American squadrons had found the Japanese fleet at the exact same moment. At 10:22 a.m., the first American planes tipped over into their dives. From high altitude, they fell almost vertically toward the carriers, air brakes screaming, pilots focused entirely on their targets. Japanese sailors looked up and saw dark shapes dropping from the sky. There was almost no time to react. The first bombs hit Kaga. Explosions tore through her flight deck. Flames erupted instantly as aviation fuel ignited. Planes, bombs, and torpedoes detonated in rapid succession. Within seconds, the hangar deck became a furnace. Moments later, bombs slammed into Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. One penetrated near the midship elevator and detonated inside the hangar where aircraft were being refueled and rearmed. A chain reaction of fire and explosions ripped through the carrier. Nagumo was forced to abandon ship, then Soryu was struck. Like the others, her decks were filled with exposed fuel and munitions. She too burst into flames almost immediately. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful carriers had been turned into burning wrecks. Black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. Fire raged out of control. Damage control crews fought desperately, but it was hopeless. The carriers had been caught at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible condition, and the accuracy of the American bombing was devastating. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese sailors were the ones staring at uncontrollable infernos on their own ships. Vice Admiral Nagumo, now aboard a destroyer, could only watch as his command disintegrated. But the battle was not over. One carrier remained untouched. Hiryu. Her commander, Captain Tomeo Kaku, acted quickly. Within minutes, Hiryu began launching a counterstrike. Japanese dive bombers found USS Yorktown and attacked with precision. Bombs struck the carrier, knocking out boilers and halting her in the water. Later, torpedo planes hit her again, causing severe flooding. For a moment, it seemed that Japan had found a way to respond. Yorktown was left dead in the water, burning and listing. Her crew fought heroically to save her, restoring partial power and correcting the list. The ship refused to sink, but American reconnaissance planes were already searching for Hiryu. By mid-afternoon, they found her. Once again, American dive bombers descended from the sky. This time, Hiryu had no protection. Her fighters were gone, her decks were exposed, bombs struck with brutal accuracy. Fires erupted across the carrier, just as they had on the others. By sunset, all 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor were either sinking or abandoned. The pride of the Japanese Navy, The core of the Kido Butai had been destroyed in a single afternoon. And across the Pacific, a quiet realization began to form. The balance of power had just shifted. As night fell over the Pacific on June 4th, 1942, the ocean around Midway was illuminated not by moonlight, but by the burning remains of what had once been the most feared carrier force in the world. Fires still raged aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Explosions echoed intermittently as ammunition stores continued to detonate deep inside the ships. Thick columns of black smoke drifted into the darkening sky, visible for miles. Japanese destroyers moved carefully through the water, rescuing survivors from the oil-covered sea, while others prepared to scuttle the dying carriers with torpedoes to prevent capture. For the Japanese sailors in the water clinging to debris, the reality was incomprehensible. Only hours earlier, they had believed themselves part of an unstoppable fleet executing another precise operation. Now, they floated in burning fuel, watching their pride sink beneath the waves. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, far to the rear with the main battleship force aboard Yamato, received fragmented reports throughout the afternoon and evening. At first, the messages were confusing. Then they became alarming. Finally, they became devastatingly clear. 1 carrier lost, then 2, then 3, then 4. Yamamoto had designed Operation MY to eliminate American carrier power in a single decisive blow. Instead, the opposite had happened. The core of his elite carrier force, the very instrument that had made Pearl Harbor possible, had been destroyed in less than a day. He immediately ordered the remaining forces to withdraw. But the battle was not quite finished. On June 5th and 6th, American aircraft continued searching for retreating Japanese ships. They found the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, which had collided while maneuvering to avoid a submarine. Their damage made them easy targets. American dive bombers attacked repeatedly. Mikuma was hit multiple times and eventually sank. Mogami barely escaped, heavily damaged and burning. The destruction continued even as the Japanese fleet tried to disengage. Meanwhile, American forces faced their own tragedy. Although USS Yorktown had survived the air attacks from Hiryu, she was later struck by torpedoes from the Japanese submarine the 168, while salvage crews worked to save her. The hits were fatal. Yorktown rolled over and sank on June 7th. The destroyer USS Haman, assisting with repairs, was also sunk. The victory had come at a cost, but the strategic reality was undeniable. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, hundreds of aircraft, and, most critically, a large portion of its most experienced naval aviators. These pilots were not easily replaced. Their training had taken years. Their combat experience was irreplaceable. The United States, by contrast, had lost 1 carrier but retained its trained air groups. And unlike Japan, America's industrial machine was only beginning to awaken. Shipyards along both coasts were already laying down new carriers. Aircraft factories were increasing output at a pace Japan could never hope to match. For the first time since the war began, the Japanese Navy was on the defensive. In Tokyo, the news of the disaster was tightly controlled. Survivors were ordered not to speak of what had happened. Official reports minimized the losses. The public was told only that a battle had occurred with mixed results. The full truth was considered too damaging to morale, but inside the Imperial Navy's command structure, there was no illusion. The myth of invincibility had been shattered. Officers studied reports in disbelief. How had the Americans known where to be? How had dive bombers appeared at the worst possible moment? How had a plan so carefully constructed unraveled so quickly? There was no single answer. It had been a combination of intelligence, timing, sacrifice, and decisions made by individuals in moments of uncertainty. Men like Joseph Rochefort, who broke the code. Men like Chester Nimitz, who chose to gamble his carriers. Men like Wade McCluskey, who followed a destroyer's wake instead of turning back. Men like the torpedo pilots of VT-8, who flew into certain death and pulled the Japanese fighters out of position. Each of those actions on its own seemed small. Together, they had changed the course of the war. By the time the smoke cleared over Midway, the Japanese expansion across the Pacific had reached its high water mark. From this point forward, every major naval engagement would be fought with Japan trying to hold territory rather than expand it. The initiative had shifted, the psychological balance had shifted, and somewhere inside the Japanese high command, a quiet realization settled in. One that would never be admitted publicly, but could not be ignored privately. The United States had recovered from Pearl Harbor far faster than anyone had expected, and now, the hunters were being hunted. In the weeks that followed the Battle of Midway, the Pacific Ocean returned to its usual silence. Wreckage drifted, oil slicks slowly dispersed. The physical evidence of the battle faded with time. But what Midway had taken from Japan could not be replaced, repaired, or rebuilt with steel. What had been lost was experience. Before Midway, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed something far more valuable than ships, a generation of elite naval aviators forged in years of combat over China and across the Pacific. These pilots had trained in an unforgiving system that produced small numbers of exceptionally skilled airmen. They had mastered carrier landings, long-range navigation, and coordinated strike tactics that few others in the world understood, and in a single day, hundreds of them were gone. When Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu burned, it was not just aircraft and metal that were consumed. Many of the pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor were aboard those carriers, squadron leaders, veteran flight instructors, men who had accumulated thousands of flight hours in combat conditions. Japan could build new planes, Japan could even build new carriers, but Japan could not rebuild those men. The Japanese naval aviation training system, designed for quality over quantity, now became a fatal weakness. Training a new carrier pilot took years. The United States, by contrast, had already begun expanding a massive training pipeline capable of producing thousands of pilots annually. American pilots might have had less experience at first, but they would soon overwhelm Japan through sheer numbers. Midway exposed a problem Japan had not anticipated. It had designed a military machine optimized for early victories, not for sustained war. In Washington, the mood was cautious but quietly optimistic. Admiral Chester Nimitz understood the magnitude of what had happened. He did not celebrate publicly. He did not boast. But internally, he knew that the Pacific War had entered a new phase. The United States no longer needed to survive. It could begin planning how to advance. And that planning began almost immediately. American shipyards were already producing Essex-class aircraft carriers, larger and more capable than anything Japan could build. Factories were turning out new aircraft models at an accelerating pace. Training bases across the country were filling with young pilots learning the very tactics that had succeeded at Midway. The United States had turned the corner. In Tokyo, however, the situation was very different. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff studied the battle reports with growing concern. They realized that their plan had failed not because of bad luck, but because the Americans had known far too much. There were suspicions of code breaking, but no proof. They struggled to understand how American carriers had appeared at exactly the right place at exactly the right time. More troubling was the realization that they could not replace what they had lost quickly enough to maintain offensive momentum. Future operations would have to be scaled back. Riskier plans would have to be reconsidered. Caution began to creep into Japanese strategy where confidence had once dominated. The next major campaign, the struggle for Guadalcanal, would reveal this shift clearly. Instead of advancing, Japan would find itself trying desperately to hold territory against an increasingly aggressive American Navy. Midway had done something subtle but profound. It had broken Japan's rhythm. Until that point, Japan had been dictating the tempo of the war. It chose when and where to strike. It forced the Allies to react. After Midway, that dynamic reversed. Now Japan would be reacting to American moves, trying to defend against a growing industrial and military tide. And all of this had happened because of a battle that lasted only 4 days. 4 days that destroyed 4 carriers, 4 days that erased years of pilot experience. 4 days that shifted the initiative in the Pacific from Japan to the United States. From that point forward, Japan would fight with skill, courage, and determination. But it would never again fight from a position of overwhelming naval superiority. The illusion of invincibility was gone. And the men who had once sailed confidently across the Pacific now understood that every future battle would be harder than the last. Because after Midway, they were no longer fighting to expand an empire. They were fighting to prevent its collapse. History often compresses battles into dates, ship names, and strategic outcomes. But the Battle of Midway was shaped not only by fleets and plans, but by individual decisions made by men who had no way of knowing that their choices would echo through history. In a dim air-conditioned room at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort sat surrounded by papers covered in strings of numbers. He was not a frontline officer. He never saw the ocean during the battle. He never heard the roar of engines or the thunder of bombs. But without him, the battle might have unfolded very differently. Rochefort's insistence that AF meant Midway, his clever deception involving the water shortage message, and his relentless push to interpret incomplete intelligence gave Admiral Nimitz something priceless: knowledge before the fight began. Beside him was Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, whose deep understanding of Japanese naval thinking helped translate raw code fragments into meaningful predictions. Layton convinced Nimitz that the Japanese would attack in early June. That confidence allowed Nimitz to position his carriers exactly where they needed to be. Then there was Chester W. Nimitz himself. His decision was not obvious. He could have held his carriers back to protect what remained of the fleet. He could have played cautiously, waiting for more ships, more planes, more preparation. Instead, he gambled everything on a calculated ambush. If he had been wrong, the United States might have lost its last carriers in the Pacific. He chose to fight. On the morning of June 4th, Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron of Torpedo Squadron 8 faced his own moment of decision. He believed his squadron was flying in the wrong direction. Instead of following orders, he turned toward where he thought the enemy would be. His entire squadron was wiped out, but they were the first to find the Japanese fleet. Their sacrifice dragged enemy fighters down to sea level at the most critical moment of the battle. Ensign George Gay, the lone survivor of VT-8, floated in the oil-covered water for hours, pretending to be dead while watching Japanese carriers burn. From the surface of the ocean, he witnessed the turning point of the Pacific War firsthand. High above, Wade McCluskey made the decision that perhaps mattered most. Running low on fuel, unsure of the enemy's location, he chose not to turn back. He followed the wake of a destroyer, trusting instinct over protocol. That decision placed his dive bombers directly over the Japanese carriers at the exact moment they were most vulnerable. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie from Yorktown, arriving from another direction, joined the attack by coincidence. Two independent squadrons, guided by separate decisions, converged on the same target within minutes. Even on the Japanese side, individuals acted with skill and urgency. Captain Tomeo Kaku of Hiryu launched a rapid counterattack that nearly destroyed Yorktown. Damage control teams aboard the burning Japanese carriers fought desperately against impossible odds. Pilots flew back toward ships that were already on fire, unsure if they had anywhere to land. These were not abstract forces. These were men acting in moments of confusion, fear, courage, and determination. The outcome of Midway was not inevitable. It was shaped by a chain of human decisions, each one building on the last. If Rochefort had been wrong, Nimitz would have been blind. If Nimitz had hesitated, the carriers would not have been in position. If Waldron had followed orders, the Japanese fighters might have remained high in the sky. If McCluskey had turned back, the dive bombers would never have found their targets. Midway was not won by numbers alone. It was won by people. And that is what makes the story endure. Because in the middle of war, in the middle of chaos, a handful of decisions made by individuals changed the course of history in less than 5 minutes. Years later, when historians and naval officers looked back at the Pacific War, many of them would agree on something remarkable about Midway. It was not the largest battle. It did not involve the most ships. It did not produce the highest casualty numbers. And yet, it was the moment when the direction of the war quietly reversed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Before Midway, every major headline in the Pacific had carried the same message. Japan advancing, Allies retreating, the Philippines falling, Singapore collapsing, Dutch colonies disappearing, American ships burning. The story of the war, to that point, had been one of Japanese initiative and Allied survival. After Midway, that narrative never returned. From that point forward, the story of the Pacific would slowly become one of American pressure and Japanese resistance. The change did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, island by island, battle by battle. But the foundation of that reversal was laid in those 5 minutes when dive bombers fell from the sky onto crowded carrier decks. Midway did something that few battles in history accomplish. It changed what both sides believed was possible. For Japan, it shattered the belief that superior training, coordination, and early momentum could overcome the long-term realities of industrial war. It forced Japanese commanders to accept that their margin for error had vanished. They could no longer afford bold gambles. They could no longer assume surprise would always be on their side. For the United States, it did the opposite. It replaced fear with confidence. It replaced uncertainty with clarity. It showed that Japan's navy could be beaten not by matching it ship for ship, but by outthinking it, outmaneuvering it, and striking at the right moment. Midway also exposed the growing importance of intelligence in modern warfare. This was not simply a battle won by guns and bombs. It was won by codebreakers, analysts, and decisions made weeks before the first plane took off. It demonstrated that information could be as powerful as firepower. And perhaps most importantly, Midway proved that timing in war can matter more than numbers. And then the United States did not have more carriers that day. It did not have more experienced pilots. It did not have a stronger fleet. What it had was preparation, awareness, and the willingness to act decisively when the opportunity appeared. That combination turned a desperate defensive situation into a strategic turning point. As American forces began planning their next moves, Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, the long push across the Pacific, they did so with a new understanding. That they were no longer trying to stop Japan, they were preparing to roll it back. And far across the ocean, Japanese commanders were preparing for something they had not anticipated when the war began. A long, exhausting struggle to prevent the inevitable. Because in those 4 days at Midway, something fundamental had shifted. Not just ships sinking, not just planes destroyed, but the direction of the war itself. For 4 days in June of 1942, far from any mainland in a stretch of ocean most people had never heard of, a handful of decisions, moments of courage, and minutes of opportunity reshaped the entire Pacific War. What began as a carefully planned Japanese trap became the moment their naval dominance collapsed, not because they lacked strength, but because the United States was ready at exactly the right time. Midway did not end the war that week, but it ended something just as important: the belief that Japan could not be stopped. From that point forward, the direction of the conflict had changed, and everyone involved, on both sides, could feel it, even if the world could not yet see it. I hope the pride of remembering this story makes you want to experience many more stories like this one. If it did, you're more than welcome to be part of this journey by subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching, because that's why this is a story to be proud of.